Good morning and welcome to today's accountability meeting. Before I commence proceedings, can I thank the Chief Constable, Jo Farrell, and members of her senior leadership team for joining me today to participate in the first recorded public accountability meeting. The focus of today's meeting will be around the proposed centralisation of the police custody provision in the Force area. As a democratically elected Police and Crime Commissioner, I'm committed to being open and transparent in conducting my duties, and over the last few weeks I have given the residents of County Durham and Darlington the opportunity to put forward their questions and comments to me about this proposal. I'm delighted to say that we've received a really good response to this public consultation, which has included positive comments and questions residents would like Durham Constabulary to respond to in more detail. A full recording of this meeting, including questions and answers, will be uploaded on YouTube after the meeting and will be made available to the public. It's my desire to live stream future public accountability meetings. Until now, accountability meetings, where the PCC holds the Chief Constable and the Force to account for policing in the area, have not been open to the public or recorded. But as your newly elected PCC, I want to address the current situation by being more open, accountable and transparent in the delivery of my duties and decision making. The recorded meetings will enable residents to see how the accountability process works and the role the PCC plays in delivering an efficient and effective police service by scrutinising the performance of the force and ensuring it is responsive to the needs of residents of County Durham and Darlington. Since my appointment in May this year, the proposal to centralise the custody provision in the Force area has been my primary focus. I've invested a lot of time in scrutinising the business case, the risks, legal issues, contractual and financial issues relating to the proposed centralised custody facility. I've also used the time to visit the custody suites in the Force area and those in the region that have centralised custody facilities and reviewed the recent inspection reports that identified the necessary improvements required to meet Home Office compliance standards. However, before I make the final decision whether to proceed with this, I felt it was very important to provide members of the public with an opportunity to submit their questions so I can raise them on their behalf directly with the Chief Constable and her team. Following this formal accountability meeting, I feel I will have all the information at my disposal to make an informed decision about the most appropriate custody option for the Force. I trust this new progressive approach will enable me to give residents the opportunity to raise what matters most to them, so I can hold the Chief Constable to account on their behalf and make County Durham and Darlington safer, stronger and more resilient to crime and antisocial behaviour. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who submitted questions and shared comments around the proposed centralised custody suite. For all those residents who provided me with their name and address, I will ensure that my office provide you with a personal response on my behalf. I'd now like to talk through the format of today's accountability and who will be in attendance today. In a few minutes, I will invite the Chief Constable, Jo Farrell, to provide some operational context and background information around the proposal for a centralised custody suite. There will then be a half-hour presentation delivered by senior members of staff from the Force executive team. Following this presentation, I will read out a selection of public questions that have been sent to me by the residents of County Durham and Darlington, and I will direct them to the Chief Constable and her team, who will provide appropriate responses. Not surprisingly, some of the questions I received had similar themes, so these have been grouped together to avoid repetition, but will still address residents' concerns and queries. Unfortunately, it hasn't been practical to extend this invitation to all the key partners and stakeholders, but I would like to take this opportunity to thank other attendees, Mr. Eddie Bell, Chair of the Independent Joint Audit Committee, and members of my team and the Constabulary who were behind the scenes providing the necessary support during this meeting. The meeting is expected to last about 90 minutes, and I do hope that members of the public will find the content useful to assist them in having a better understanding about how I will continue to hold the force to account to address policing issues and to ensure Durham Constabulary is an efficient and effective police force. I'd now like to hand over to the Chief Constable, Joe Farrell, who will provide some operational context and background information around the proposal for a centralised custody provision.
Good morning. Thank you, Commissioner, and thanks for the opportunity for myself and the team to discuss the proposals around a centralised custody facility. Tackling criminality, investigating crime is what policing does. It's one of our core responsibilities, and the confidence that people have in us as an organisation is in part based on our ability to bring offenders to justice, to provide good outcomes for victims so that people know that if they are unfortunately the victim of crime, we will investigate those offences to the highest standard. Custody is a provision that allows us to carry out that investigation. So people are arrested, and within the custody environment, we can investigate crime by way of securing evidence through interviews, securing forensic evidence by seizing exhibits and maybe clothing, and by examining all of the detail and evidence that we have available to us. So it's a key part of our policing operation. Currently, the custody facilities are spread across the county. Some of them are, or they're in various degrees of age and condition. And in order to move forward as an organisation, in order to provide the right environment, both for those people who are arrested and also for staff and officers who are working in the environment, things have moved on. Regulation has changed in this area. It's well regulated and is subject to a lot of legal obligation, both going back around Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which is a piece of legislation that's been in for some considerable time, but issues around equality, diversity, issues in relation to fire regulations, as you would expect. And when we look at our current estate, it is outdated, it is of poor quality, and it doesn't provide the right environment to deliver high quality investigation and at the same time ensure that we comply with all the rules and regulations when we take somebody into custody. We are taking away their liberty, and there are a number of obligations on us in relation to how we comply with the regulations around that. And the current facilities raise issues of safety, privacy, security and dignity, and the new proposals address all of those issues. You may say, well, how are you dealing with those issues currently? Well, we are mitigating a number of those issues, but they tend to be through a very resource intensive way, and within that lots of backlog in the system, and we'll talk about some of the issues of efficiency that currently exist with an ageing estate. We know from all of the consultation that's taken place to date, the issues around travelling times is something that occurs, and a number of questions in relation to that, describing what this new provision looks like. People have asked us questions around what happens when you release people from custody. We've had questions in relation to noise and congestion. We'll cover all of those issues during the presentation and in the Q&A session. So the team now will work through the presentation and we'll ensure that we have dealt with all of the commonly occurring questions that we've had throughout this consultation period. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. That's been really helpful to put that into context. And so now I think it gives us an opportunity to go over to the presentation. And we've got Michelle March, Head of Estate, and Chief Inspector Jason Meacham from Custody Management, following which I will put the public's questions to them. So it's over to you.
Victoria, can you see my screen?
Yep, good.
Okay. Start, Jason.
Morning, everybody.
Morning.
Okay, so first of all, why do we detain people? Why do we arrest people? Essentially, it's to facilitate and to also ensure protection of the person who's arrested, and maybe other people in the community, victims, and other people around in the general vicinity. Custody buildings don't just include cells. They're a much wider building than that. They include investigation facilities, interview rooms, search areas, biometric data collection rooms, talking DNA samples, fingerprints, photographs, etc. And also a lot of other evidence gathering capability, smart water, etc. So they aren't just cells. It's not just somewhere we keep people. What's really important is it's not only the level of care we give when we're looking after people in detention, it's the quality and the integrity of the evidence. If we don't do it right in custody, if we don't take the evidence in compliance with the legislation, we don't take the right opportunities, we lose those opportunities to get the best judicial outcome for victims. If we don't do it right here, we lose cases at court and let people down, which is clearly not what we're intending to do. So as the Chief alluded to, our existing facilities spread across the county. They're old, they're out of date, they're really problematic to maintain, and it makes looking after people safely really, really problematic and really expensive and ineffective. And we mitigate that by essentially using a lot of additional staff that we wouldn't necessarily have to. And it makes it a really time-consuming and inefficient process. So how do we manage detainees in custody? So really anyone, irrespective of the sort of walk of life or the social background, can find themselves arrested. Sometimes this is a regular occurrence for them, unfortunately, for various reasons. And sometimes people get arrested only once in their life due to a mistake or any other circumstances. It could be your brother, your sister, your mother, your father, a friend, your neighbor. It could be you that gets arrested. These things happen, unfortunately. But people in detention with us, they're generally more vulnerable than they are dangerous. People come into us in all sorts of states with mental health issues, problematic drug issues, and even if normally they're not vulnerable, you're guaranteed when they come into detention for the first time, it's a really intimidating place. No matter how much we care for people and how much attention our staff give, they're vulnerable, they're unfamiliar, and they're worried and concerned, and it's our job to not only look after them, but to make sure that we gain those evidential opportunities. So we need to ensure that any facility we have is safe, secure, efficient, and we not only look after people correctly and in compliance with legislation, but also that we get that evidence and get it correctly. So it crops up a lot what actually happens in custody, but really it's a convoluted process. So there's a bit of a process chart here which illustrates some of the steps, and it's not all of them, but maybe the more common ones that a detainee will go through from the minute they're arrested to when they're released at the other end. So essentially, you'll be arrested, say for theft, for example, you'll travel to the police station, you'll be booked in and taken to reception where it's the charge desk or the custody sergeant, the booking in desk, and you'll be asked questions about your name, your address, why you've been arrested. You'll be assessed in terms of your mental health, any illnesses you might have, and we'll look at your previous history and how you're a particular worry to us in terms of your welfare. After that, you'll be searched, your property will be taken off you, any evidence will be seized, and you'll be placed in a cell. Sometime after, so your legal rights, if you want to speak to a solicitor, you'll undoubtedly have one on a telephone with a solicitor or legal representative. That's really problematic in our current state. We really struggle to give confidential telephone calls because we don't have the booths, we don't have our private rooms, and you don't really want to give a prisoner who might be angry a mobile phone. Really, really problematic. That alone is a legal requirement. We don't do it correctly, we run the risk of losing cases because we're not complying with legislation. So people will be in the cell, then they'll go for biometrics. So they'll have their fingerprints taken, the photograph taken, footwear maybe, DNA samples certainly. If we don't do that correctly at that point, again, we risk the case of miscarriages of justice, not missing evidential opportunities. We don't take the DNA in forensically secured environments. So when we're taking DNA samples, is that accurate? The systems at the moment, increasingly so, that really need a very sterile, very clean room to take these samples in. We can't provide that at the minute. We have to mitigate that, and there's a risk that, again, we lose cases for legal challenge for not taking these opportunities correctly. So once the biometrics are taken, people return to the cell. You might have a medical examination. That would be with a doctor. At the minute, or doctor or nurse, at the minute we have 3 custody sites operational, but at any one time we'll only have 1, maybe 2 medical professionals on duty. They also cover a lot of additional stuff outside of custody. So at least at any one time, 2 of our custody facilities do not have 24/7 medical care, which adds pressure to the organisation. It means we have to take officers off the street because they have to supervise these detainees whilst we're waiting at the medical professional to arrive, or increasingly we would have to take them to hospital because we don't have a medical professional there to assess them quickly enough to say, no, they're going to be okay, we can treat them in the custody environment. So a lot of these things so far, if you look at the age of our buildings, we didn't need to do these things 20, 30, 40 years ago when our buildings were built. Legislation has changed, standards have raised. We now have to comply with all these issues, and we want to, but we simply can't with the current facilities. So you might be medically examined, you're taken back to the cell. This is all still before interview. And then, as I said, unfortunately, a lot of our detainees have significant mental health issues connected to or brought on by drugs. We can't interview somebody realistically without a mental health assessment. Should we do so, we're in breach of legislation, and every evidence gained in the interview will be dismissed realistically. So these things take time. In our current facilities, we don't have dedicated rooms for mental health assessments. So what tends to happen is they will use the doctor's surgery for the mental health assessment. That leads to a queue because we need those rooms at the same time for multiple prisoners. So we get this build-up of pressure and blockages because we don't have the right facilities for what we are required to do now. Mental health assessment can take anywhere from 10, 15 minutes to an hour in more complicated cases. So detainee will go back to the cell. They then might have their actual legal consultation. The solicitor or the legal rep might have attended the station and they'd have already spoken to the officer in the case, and then they'll have a discussion about the interview. Then finally they'll be interviewed and they'll go to the cell after that, and they'll be disposed of subsequently, either charge, bail, etc. But I'll come on to that. But that's just a snapshot of a relatively routine custody process. If you're a foreign national, you don't speak English, there's interpreters. If you need an appropriate adult, there's professional appropriate adults or member of family come and look after you. Really, really convoluted, really complicated. I've not talked about at all what the officer in the case or the interviewing officer is doing here. He or she will be speaking to the legal consultants, legal solicitors, will be speaking to the CPS potentially to get charging advice, and they'll most definitely be speaking to the custody sergeant about what are we going to do, Sarge? What are the options here? What's the best way? How do I progress the case? So it's not simply arrest, interview, and let out the door. There is a step-by-step process, and each step we have to take really, really accurate and really safely and carefully to not only look after the person, but to make sure critically that we comply with legislation and we ensure that we take those opportunities to ensure justice is allowed to occur. So our current provision is 4 designated custody sites. The oldest one, Bishop Auckland, we haven't used really since about 2 years ago. We use it very occasionally. It only has 9 cells. Really problematic to use. From a practical perspective, there's probably only 7 cells you could use there. The heating is inefficient. In the winter, 2 cells so cold you wouldn't put anybody in them. And the same 2 cells, because of the location in the summer, they are like a sauna. And frankly, we wouldn't tend to put people in them. So we would have to staff to the same levels as a 15-cell facility. For 7 cells, it's just inefficient, and we haven't used it for some time. Darlington and Durham, both 15. Darlington again, and Durham, both cramped, old-fashioned, both really problematic to maintain. We frequently close cells or the premises themselves to refurbish and or do big maintenance. Darlington has a big damp issue, for example. Durham, problematic, not all the cells are equipped with CCTV, and that's just 2 examples of the problems we have there. Peterlee is our most modern facility, built about approximately 20 years ago. But as I said, even since 2001, legislation has changed subsequently. The DNA capability is much more accurate in terms of the accuracy and the forensic requirements we have. It just, despite being a relatively new building, it still doesn't meet the current standards, which every few years are raised. So there are a number of pressing issues that we really need to address, which is obviously why we're in the position we're in now. So the condition, as I sort of alluded to, we have a really aging estate. We have issues with cells being out of action, they're easily damaged. If I talk about Bishop Auckland, for example, all of the cell facilities there, including the toilets, they are unique to that building. When they break, which is frequently, we can't just go to B&Q or any other plumber merchant to obtain the parts. They have to be made by bespoke for that particular facility. They're all riveted in. It takes days to replace a simple piece of a toilet that might be replaced in 30 minutes in your house. Really, really problematic to fix them. None of the buildings we have comply with the Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary requirements. We've been inspected twice over the last decade, and on both occasions, clearly, a matter of public interest, that we've been criticised for the state of the facilities in terms of the dignity. We have showers on main corridor routes, so if you're having a shower in custody, you have other prisoners walking past you, even with a shower curtain. There's no dignity there. We have cells without toilets. Unfortunately, some of these cells are the cells we keep children in. So if you're a child which is an under 18, you have to ask permission to go to the toilet in some of our cells. None of our cells have drinking water in. If you want a drinking water, if you want a drink, you have to ask permission. The staff have to go and see you and give you drink. And again, only a few of them have actually washing facilities, but none have drink. It's wholly unacceptable in 2021 that we can't allow people to go to the toilet in a cell. It really is. So forensic regulation, we talked about quite a bit. The standards increase all the time. We need to do this if we're to satisfy our requirements and keep people safe and ensure that we take these crimes to court. We give the CPS the best opportunity to get successful prosecution. It's about getting these interviews done correctly. It's about showing the rights and getting the forensic samples done correctly. So operational capability, really, we're limited. We have looked at length at opportunities to use our existing estate to refurbish, to demolish, to build into the car parks or additional pieces of land we might own adjacent to the buildings. But unfortunately, despite having looked at and had architects look at it for us, the limitations of the estate and the size required for modern custody buildings, it's just not practical if you are talking about things like vehicle docks, and then the size of the scale you need to make those efficiencies. There just isn't the size of the space, unfortunately. So just a quick example here of an existing versus proposed charge desk. Joy, you'll have been with me to the charge desk on the left. That's at Peterlee. That's relatively spacious compared to the Darlington one. But looking at the photograph on the left, there is no room behind the photographer. So the photographer is effectively against the back wall. So there is minimal space there. So that is the opportunity where somebody's booked in, they're brought in under arrest, and the custody sergeant's facing the camera. The sergeant will ask the person, what have you been arrested for? What's your mental health issues? Why have you been arrested? And ask a lot of personal questions. It takes about 20, 25 minutes to book somebody in. There's no privacy there. There's no confidentiality. There's no dignity. You see the doorway on the left. That's the main thoroughfare for the staff to go through. If the staff want to go to anywhere else in that custody facility, they have to walk past that desk, past that person who's being arrested possibly for the first time, who's possibly a child, who's possibly in distress, or possibly who's fighting and resisting. It's really problematic to manage. There's no dignity. There's no safety. It's difficult for our staff and our officers to deal with people simply and safely there. The facility on the right is the proposed charge desk for the new building. You'll see it's very, very spacious. There's 6 booking in areas there. That photograph's slightly odd. There's been 1 or 2 little adjustments, but it's really secure, really safe. If people are problematic to deal with, it can be dealt with safely. People can be confidentially booked in separately. Multiple things can be happening at multiple times. The charge desk on the left, that one location is a blockage for the entire building. You can only do one thing at a time there. You can only deal with one person. So whilst this one person's booking in, it's problematic to take people to interview and do it correctly. It's problematic to access computers to answer questions from solicitors or other officers who need details and to progress other prisoners in custody. At that time, that one desk is being occupied by one person. It really is a bit of a blockage, and that's reflected across the entire estate. Say 1 or 2 of the stations are actually worse than that. So 1 or 2 IT issues. Just forgive me for a moment. Is that still coming through on your screen? Should be working now. How are we now?
That's
Brilliant.
it.
So I talked there about delays in custody, and I know there's some questions about the travel time and implications for people moving across the county with detainees, but it's useful to illustrate the issues we have in custody at the minute. So I've been through, in June, I took a week more or less to look at every case that came through custody and picked a selection, a relatively large selection of cases where, whilst there is travel time, which we have now and always will do, there's absolutely unacceptable queues in custody. So if you look at the top one, these are all for Darlington. So on Monday, the 21st of June, about 8:30 in the morning, somebody was arrested within Darlington City Centre for theft, or Darlington broadly. It took 30 minutes to get to custody, and that might have been due to the time of the morning, rush hour. It might have been on the outskirts of Darlow. So it took 30 minutes to get there. They got to Darlington backyard at 9:05, and then they sat in the backyard for 43 minutes with a prisoner, because there was a queue in custody. The custody sergeant was busy, there was a blockage, and they couldn't allow them in. You've been to Darlington station. There is no secure facility outside to detain detainees. So essentially they were either sitting in the car, which is problematic with the detainee because they're likely to be handcuffed, they should be, which has risks of positional asphyxia when you're looking after somebody for extended periods of time, particularly if they're stressed. And if they're just about to go into custody, that's probably the most stressful period for them, is to fight or flight risk. So they're highly stressed, the breathing rate has gone up, and they're handcuffed, and the positional asphyxia is a risk. The potential risk for allegations against the officers who are looking after them in terms of both physical assault and or allegations of discussion about the case, etc. And whilst they have body cameras, it's still is a bit of an issue when you're looking after somebody in a confined space. Equally, if the officers decided to take them out of the vehicle and maybe get in the fresh air and just wait if it was nice weather, at Darlington, so there is no vehicle dock where you sit or stand to come into the custody suite. It's directly adjacent to where all the staff go into the building to go about their daily business. Again, there is no privacy, there is no dignity. Again, the same day, but at 11 o'clock in the morning, not particularly busy period generally. Again, it was a local arrest. It took 30 minutes. They took 29 minutes in the backyard. Running down later in the week on the weekend, again, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Not particularly busy day. You'd expect maybe at 9 o'clock in the evening on a Saturday to be really busy. They took 96 minutes to get booked in. They'd only travelled 10 minutes from Darlington for an assault, but once they got to the backyard, it took them an hour and a half to even see a custody sergeant. So if that person had been problematic to deal with, fighting or had medical issues, there is a risk that those may not have been addressed. I would hope they would be, and that the arresting officers would say to the custody sergeant from outside that we need to get this guy booked in quickly, but we don't have the opportunity to fully assess and to fully go through the records and to speak to those people who've been arrested. And then the next day, there's a drunken disorderly. Again, this is sort of just gone midnight when expected to be busy, and it took just over an hour to book somebody, to get somebody in front of the custody sergeant, having only taken 12 minutes to get to custody. I will go on to the next station. And these are all for Durham City. Again, this is in June as well. So it's important to say, you see this one at Durham, the top one on Saturday the 5th. This person's come from Crook. We already move detainees all over the county, so you don't necessarily at the minute go to your local police station. You will be taken to where there's capacity and the staffing levels where we can cope with additional prisoners. So it's not the case if you're arrested in Durham, you always go to Durham custody. You may well go to Peterlee and or Darlington, and that's the same all over the county. Again, it took 30 minutes from Crook, and they got to Durham at about 2:45 in the morning. They took just over a quarter of an hour to even get into the station. Again, on the Monday, this is an arrest in Stanley. So Stanley to Durham, 45 minutes travel and 46 minutes in the backyard waiting. Pelton's the next one. Again, 30 to 40-minute trip and a half-hour wait in the backyard. So people are waiting constantly, and it's not only frustrating for the officers, it's unsafe for the person involved. But it's important to note that whilst these people are waiting in the backyard, it's because there's a problem in custody. If there's a problem in custody, it means the custody sergeant is tied up and that nothing else realistically is going on. There's really restrictions on interviews taking place, on the phones being answered, and safety of those detainees. And again, the bottom one is 36 minutes. I think the next slide. This is Peter Lee. And relatively quick, some of these trips to Peter Lee custody, 10 minutes from Hawthorne Blackhall. Selection of offences there, and selection of times and days. So not always when you would expect it to be overly busy. Wednesday afternoon, Thursday afternoon. You're talking 20, 30, 40 minutes nearly to get into custody once they've arrived. So really inefficient, really ineffective. And it's important to try and think, having taken you to those suites, Joy, that what's going on in those custody suites is making that queue happen. It's that blockages in terms of access to doctors, medical care, and access to custody sergeants, particularly because they can only do one thing at one time because of the facilities they have. And finally, Bishop Auckland. I did say that we don't generally have Bishop Auckland open, but recently we did open it for a week to 10 days because we had to close Darlington. Darlington had some issues and we had to close the entire facility. And we opened Bishop as a bit of a backup. So I had some stats here for Bishop, and it indicates where people will come from. And again, they're coming from all over the county, Spenny, Camden and Bishop, for varying different offences. And again, I've picked offences here and an instance that reflects different times of the day. I've not always trying to find the busy periods, but again, you see people up to or just over an hour, 63 minutes, 52, 32, 20, sat in the backyard, having taken, in some instances, only 15 minutes to get to custody. They're waiting 63 in the backyard before they're even seen. It presents no end of risk to the organisation, the individual, and to the victim in terms of the successful prosecution of this case, of their cases, these build-ups, unfortunately. So one of the sort of broad topics people have asked, and I know you've been interested in, is why we picked the location we picked for the investigation hub, the Investigative Hub. So over the last couple of years, we've looked at where our arrests come from. They come from 5 broad areas. So the coastal area, Peterlee, Hordern, Easington, obviously Darlington, Durham, the major conurbations we have. The North Durham, Old Derwentsside area of Chesley Street, Concert, Stanley, maybe if you make it slightly broader than Derwentsside. And then the wider Bishop area to include Aycliffe and Spenny. And broadly, that's where the bulk of our arrests come from. Geographically, we don't generally get many arrests from the west of the county. If you're talking Walsingham, Stanhope, Barnard Castle, we do obviously have incidents that require people to be arrested, but broadly numbers there are relatively across the year. So if you plot these onto a map and say this is broad indication, those are the indicated circles are where the bulk of our arrests come from. These are from 2019, which is relatively the last normal year we've had. And the star is obviously where the Investigative Hub is going to be located. So whilst it's not central to the county, it's central to where the bulk of our arrests come from, and it's also, as you see, very close to the main north-south route and to the A1M. So, having identified where our arrest came from, our estates team were given the task to identify a location which was suitable for the hub to be built on in terms of access to the major arterial routes to make access and egress easy, good public access in terms of bus network, and also really land that was viable in terms of cost and availability and was zoned correctly for the type of building we were after. So zooming in a little bit onto that map, this is the site. It's on the 167. You'll be familiar with it now. At the minute, the land is scrubland, for want of a better word. It's adjacent to the old Black & Decker's factory, Default, I think it is now. It's near the fire station at Spennymoor. adjacent to the GOAMI transport facility, and GOAMI are the organisation that transport our prisoners around the county. So at the minute they will go to each station and pick them up and take them to court. And you'll see, and you'll be familiar with it at the minute, we have the police dog training facility at the bottom of the map there, which we've had for some time now. So we are already sort of familiar residents in that area. There is no housing directly near adjacent to that premise. As you see, the nearest housing is some distance away on the left-hand side there, and the major route into and out of the premise, of the hub, is off the 167 and the Coach and Horses roundabout. So my colleague Michelle will take over and talk through the site location with you.
Okay, thanks, Jason. There's just a picture of the site. As you can see, not an awful lot to see at the moment. It is just a bit of a brownfield site in the middle of the estate. Sorry, my IT's not working again. There we go. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so our proposal is for a new facility. We want this to be Home Office guidance compliant for all of the reasons that Jason's explained. We're looking at a 48 cell radial layout of the facility, which will include an investigation suite. It will include our CSI facility, which is required to meet ISO standards now, and also will include a centralised property store adjacent to the building. So that's just a picture of the approach. This was included in our planning application. As you can see there, it does not look like a custodial facility on the approach. It is an attractive modern building. And that's just a bit of a 3D view of the facility. So that sort of semicircle that you can see, that is the 48 cell radial facility. You can see the 4 arms there, the van duct to the rear, and then you can see the investigation facility and the public entrance to the front. You can see the CSI facility and the property store there. That's the long building that's adjacent. That's just an image showing you the charge desk view. As you can see, we have privacy fins there, completely different to the facilities we've got in our existing estate. You know, I think any of our buildings at the moment, we have a maximum of 2 checking in points. You know, we're going to have 7 in the new facility to include a discrete one. So in terms of timescales, we have acquired the site, we have obtained planning permission. We have the design now complete, ready for tender issue. So should we be given approval to obtain, we suggest that the earliest completion date will be spring 2023.
Thanks, Michelle. So detainees, I talked at the start of the presentation about the process. Quite a few of the questions we've had whilst we've been dealing with this project is how we deal with the detainees upon release, what happens to them, and any concerns about how they will get home, particularly from this location. So be interesting, I think, to explain to you the process that we go through, or custody sergeants go through when people are finished at the current custody sites, which will be reflected at the new one. So not all detainees first who arrive in custody are actually released and they don't go home. Some will be securely transported to court, to prison, or to other police stations across the country if we've arrested them on their behalf. But individuals who are charged with the much more serious offences, almost exclusively are either a bail risk or the risk to the public, will be more likely to refuse bail, if they're in a warrant, they won't get bail at all, and they will be taken directly to court via GOAMI, and they are not released from custody out the front door at all. Oh, sorry, our screen's locked again. So we're just working on it. But so the next slide talks about detainees who aren't released from custody. Essentially, they fall into several categories. People who are charged and remanded and are taken directly to court by GOAMI. Those who are recalled to prison, again, will be taken by GOME straight to prison. People on a warrant, people on breach of bail, or those collected by another force. So those who are released from custody fall into several categories. So those who have been charged and bailed to court, so they've been charged with a criminal offence, they've got a court date, given a bit of paper, and they have conditions to attend court on a date in the future and to abide by certain conditions the custody sergeant puts on them. Those who are released on bail for further inquiries, we've not quite finished the investigation yet, we have further work to do. They're released, sometimes with conditions. Those without conditions who are released on bail, and then people who are cautioned, so the case is actually finished and they've been cautioned or otherwise finalised, and some people obviously clearly no further action, and there is no further action to be taken against them, and they are allowed to walk out. But for all of these people, anybody who we release from custody, we have a continuing duty of care for them, and that's really critical. Our responsibility for these people does not end the second they walk out the custody door. We have to have a similar level of care to them when they leave, and I'll go through that process on why that is the case. So vulnerable detainees. First of all, a juvenile, which is anybody under 18 from our perspective, is always vulnerable. They are treated differently to anybody else. Detainees who are vulnerable are never simply released. We have a risk assessment called an exit risk assessment using a Thrive procedure at the end of a custody period, whereby the custody sergeant will talk to them, assess the circumstances of their arrest and what's happened to them in the period of custody. So it might be that they've been arrested for a particularly abhorrent offence, which would lead to public embarrassment, and maybe that's their first time in custody, but that particular offence, that particular time, is quite possibly going to affect them for the rest of their life, because normally they're perfectly stable. At that time, they're really, really vulnerable. Equally, somebody could be vulnerable for their mental health long-term factors, or it could be something as simple as they've got a pair of shorts on. The clothing could be entirely inappropriate for the weather outside. It could be 2 foot of snow. It could be October. It could be 3 in the morning. The whole host of factors that the custody sergeant consider before somebody's released and simply allowed to walk out the door. So with juveniles, we'd never do that. But if this custody sergeant identifies them as vulnerable, the options for us is obviously parent, relative, or friend can take them home. If they're vulnerable, it's highly likely they've had an appropriate adult in custody, and that appropriate adult would be in a position to take them home. It's possible, again, the next one down will be a social services professional person to take them up home. Legal representative on occasions do it. And finally, officers, it's fair to say we will not allow a juvenile or anybody who's really vulnerable to simply walk out the door. That will not be the case. We have that level of duty of care, and that's an expectation I have of all my custody sergeants. So for those non-vulnerable detainees, which form a large amount, we would expect collection by friend, family, relative. People come into custody all the time with plenty of money in their pockets and access to cards, etc. We expect them to use that to get home by a taxi or bus. We've picked a location with a really good bus network on the 167, the north-south route. And equally, if you need to get to Durham side, you can get to Durham for connection services. If you need to get to the west of the county or the east, to Peterlee, etc., you can get to Durham and or Bishop to go to wherever you need to go. The bus routes are really good. Even on the weekends, they run till relatively late, generally when we operate. So walking, if it's viable, if they're relatively local, Bishop or Spennymoor, for example, and if no financial option is there for them, we will give them a bus ticket. We have been using bus tickets for 4 or 5 years now, whereby we buy them in bulk from the bus company, and it saves us thousands of pounds in terms of getting people back quite safely and securely, and they can use a bus ticket to come, and we will continue with that service that we currently operate. So that's the end of my discussion about how we take people home. I think, Gary, do you be able to assist with some finance questions?
Yes, thank you. In terms of affordability, the cost of this will be met by reserves, that is to say, sums of money which are a bit like personal household savings. These are sums of money owned by the Police and Crime Commissioner. All commissioners hold sums of money for these sorts of issues, i.e. investment. Therefore, there is sufficient money set aside to cover the cost of this project. In terms of the medium-term financial plan, The estimated running costs of the building have been included in the plan. There will, however, be some savings on existing buildings, in as much as there'll be less maintenance costs on the existing ones. New buildings mean you don't have to maintain light and clean the old ones. The fact that it's being funded from reserves, what this means is that the Police and Crime Commissioner is not being asked or requested to take on debt, pay for this, which would imply that the public's council tax payments are going to be used to fund the debt. That's not what's being proposed with this. I'm confident that will not be the position. Therefore, we are not going to be asking future generations of taxpayers to fund this decision. In relation to efficiencies, we know that there will be fewer sergeants required in the new custody facility. I think that is a really powerful efficiency, because these police officers can then effectively be used elsewhere to provide policing to the public. Being a new building, I do not expect there to be much in the way of repairs required in the short to medium term. We do think that there will be the same number of detention officers. These are members of police staff employed in the new facility. I think that's important. Therefore, there will not be any loss of local employment, which is an important issue. One clear efficiency we will have is that the force spends approximately £1 million a year or so through the provision of nurses and doctors into custody, and this is to look after the physical and mental health needs of the detainees. We do expect that there will be some reductions to the cost of that going forward, because there will be less travelling times for doctors and nurses. They will only be travelling to one location as opposed to four. Finally, in terms of alternatives, we did look at alternative sites. However, the requirements for these sorts of facilities are that they need to be built on flat land away from floodplains. You cannot build them as a sort of multi-storey building. They have to be, there's no stairs allowed in custody facilities these days. If we were to not go ahead with this, I feel that we would end up spending significant sums of money to repair and maintain the existing custody sites, and with the best will in the world, they will never be Home Office compliant. Equally, I think that by trying to maintain the existing assets, we would not afford us any opportunity to try and make the existing service delivery any more efficient than it already is. And I suppose my final point on alternatives is, given that some of the existing custody facilities are quite old, that the simple point is that buildings don't last forever. And even with significant sums of money spent on repairing and maintaining existing sites, we will eventually get to the position whereby just physically the fabric of the buildings becomes so old and worn and outdated that no amount of money will make them suitable for service provision, and then we'll be back to where we are essentially now, which will be, what's the alternatives, what's the issues around centralisation. Thank you.
Okay, Joy, that's the end of our presentation. It's just over to you with any questions you've got from the team.
Right, thank you. Can we stop screen sharing now then? And can I thank you all for that presentation. I thought it was very, very getting that how complex. I found out very early on what a complex issue it is, and also the complex detainees that our staff are dealing with, and the vulnerabilities, and also, as Joe alluded to, the risks that we face every hour of every day with the challenges that come through our doors. So I think that time that you've taken us through there, I'm sure I've found it very, very valuable, and I appreciate the time that you've given to really take us through all the areas and understanding custody from arrest to process, and to the complexities that we've got, and some of the inefficiencies in there as well. So I think it's now that we go over to the public's questions, and obviously we'll go through them in order, and then we'll sort of convene back and conclude the presentation today. So my first question is, residents want to know, why can't the existing custody estate be remodelled or refurbished instead of building a brand new facility?
Okay, I mean, we have touched a little bit on this in our presentation. The Home Office guidance recommends a range of supporting investigative facilities. It's not just about cells. So the charge desk needs to have sight lines down the cell wings. We need discrete booking in facilities. We should have high natural daylight levels. We should also have a van dock. These things are space hungry, and our existing sites just simply can't accommodate a layout to meet the standards of facilities that are expected. As Jason mentioned, we have examined this option before, undertaken feasibilities in our existing estate. We looked at adapting Spennymoor Police Station in 2018, which does have a small custody facility within it. It's also got some land adjacent to that owned by the PCC, so that would be quite an easy route for extension, or so we thought. We did the feasibility, and that demonstrated that there was insufficient space for us to meet a Home Office compliant facility layout. Cost comparison also showed that it was cheaper to build new than to try and renovate existing, and I have spoken to colleagues in other forces who've also found the same thing, hence why my recommendation to you is that we go down the route of building new.
Thanks, Michelle. A number of residents are also asking, prior to Durham Gate, were there any other potential sites explored?
Yes, there were. Jason did go into the site search criteria that we had. We need a site of around about 4 acres. We did initially look at opportunities to use our existing estate, as I said, and so we do own land as well. So we own land at Akeley Heads, for instance. We did look at that, but that does not meet the location criteria. It wasn't in the search window. We also contacted the County Council to understand their local plan and to try and find out where the facility would be more suitably located in terms of planning. So other sites we looked at included Meadowfield, but the available sites around there were mainly zoned for residential use. The other sort of site we looked at was Bowburn, but there the land value is much higher than at Durham Gate, and also it's got poorer public transport facilities, so Durham Gate was selected as the preferred option.
Thank you. If the project proceeds, will any contractor be asked to commit to social value benefits as part of the bid? And that's sort of given opportunities for investing in the local economy, contractors being able to bid for some of the work, creating jobs, apprentices, etc.
Yes, absolutely. We do intend to request the bidding contractors to commit to working with you in relation to the National Social Value Measurement Framework, which, as you say, includes initiatives like use of local suppliers, employing apprentices and so on. But in addition to that, we're also one of the first public sector organisations to have trialled the new Construction Value Toolkit, which is a government-led scheme which is to drive better social, environmental and economic outcomes from big projects. So we are going to be asking the contractors as well to work with us on our priorities in relation to the toolkit. So yes, there will be social value driven.
Thanks, Michelle. I think that's really important, particularly in these sort of challenging times, that if we do go ahead with this project, that we are looking to support local businesses and employment opportunities. Residents are concerned about the lost time of police officers transporting people from where they've been arrested to the custody suite, and the lost time of investigating officers going from their base to the custody suite. What could be done to minimise officers' travelling time to and from Spennymoor?
Hello, Commissioner. So I'll answer this one. So the Investigative Hub will allow for a much more effective and efficient custody process than the current facilities allow us to undertake, as we've already heard. So the custody process, as Jason has explained, can be quite lengthy. It frequently involves multiple legal consultations, which can be in phone or by person. Additionally, many of our detainees experience problematic drug issues or they have mental health issues, as we've explained. So we need to ensure that these are addressed before they go into interview. And should we not do this, any evidence that we gain via interview may become invalid, which then at the end would let our victims down. So between these consultations and assessments, detainees need to be returned to their cell. The provision of all cells with CCTV and critically also a dedicated location for a member of staff to watch that CCTV to monitor and make sure people are safe within the cells. Also having medical professionals 24 hours a day alongside dedicated facilities to treat people and help them with their mental health and mental health assessments. All of these things will dramatically lessen the need for officers to remain standing outside cells watching those vulnerable people or waiting for a medical professional to arrive, watching those detainees who have concerns or who may be fighting and resisting. But at the moment, we have no other means to observe them other than being right outside that cell. So part of the Investigative Hub project work has been to identify blockages, bottlenecks, and numerous examples, as we've already explained, and I've said there have been identified. So one example, just to sort of highlight that, took place recently at Durham Custody on the 6th of June. A detainee had been arrested, and in the process of this had also been tasered. So when somebody is tasered, the taser barbs have to be removed by a medical professional. Police officers can't do that. So in order to prevent the detainee from ripping those barbs out, causing harm to themselves, potentially causing harm to officers, the officers needed to watch that person until a medical professional arrived at the cells. And this on that occasion took just under an hour and a half. Time that otherwise those officers could have been back out on patrol or responding to public calls.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I think that's really helpful. And as you know, I think I was doing a shadow and a visit on that particular time. So I saw firsthand the complex issues that our staff are dealing with, and something like that, how time consuming it was, not just for the custody staff, but also the people who brought that person in. So I think that's really, really helpful. Thank you for that. Residents have also expressed concerns about people being released from custody and returning to their homes. Many years, a resident said that they were arrested, and following an investigation, they were released without charge at 4 a.m. in the morning, without public transport or means for a taxi. They told me they walked a couple of miles home. If there had been a centralised custody suite, then it would have taken this local resident at least 4 hours to walk home. What provisions will be put in place to ensure that when people are released, they are able to travel home safely?
Yeah, thanks, Joy. Clearly, the time involved in transportation of people to and from the custody hub is one of those issues we've looked at in great depth, and it is a concern, obviously, yourself. There's absolutely an increase in some of the mileage travelled in some instances from some locations. That's clearly a matter of fact. However, it's not simply the travel time that's the factor here. It is those delays in custody that quite frequently outweigh the increase in travel time we may experience on certain occasions. So an example would be, at the minute, our Durham City Centre custody, say 15 cells, which is the main one from the north of the county, is located splat in the middle of Durham City Centre. To get to it from the north of the Durham City, you frequently have to cross the river twice. Very, very congested area, which is frequently busy and adds to delays in transportation. So not only do we have transport delays now, we also have those ones actually when you get physically to the custody suites. So the Investigative Hub is adjacent to our main arterial road, good access to the A1, and the wider location in general doesn't experience the congestions of a city centre like Darlington or Durham do. Clearly on occasions there will be, that's the nature of travel, but in general it's a good location for major access and in and out routes to the county. As I said, the issue is wider, however, and whilst mileage times and distance times will differ, It's actually to do with the efficiencies of the new suite due to less officers required for constant observations, less time waiting to book detainees in, being able to deal with vulnerable detainees because there are alternative methods, using technology. There's going to be less requirement to attend hospital for minor medical concerns because we have 24/7 medical professionals on site. Currently, that accounts for a lot of wasted time for officers. The flow of prisoners within the facility will also be increased due to increased capacity in the building. As we've talked about earlier on, we have a duty of care to people. I know this person you're talking about obviously walked home. We have a duty of care to people who release from custody. This extends to the manner in which we allow them to leave. So everyone who leaves is subject to a thorough risk assessment, and how detainees reach home is part of that. So as I said, the hub is adjacent to a main north-south route, really good bus network to Easington and Derwent side through Durham. The location sees frequent bus services to Bishop. From the wider services to the west can be accessed. Throughout the night, clearly, services are minimal. However, whilst detainees are released during the night from police custody, that's far from the norm. It does happen on occasion, but a range of options exist to get people home from the hub, depending on the circumstances. And this may involve them waiting until the bus services resume if they're released at 4 o'clock in the morning, until maybe 6 when the buses tend to pick up again.
Thanks, Jason. With already stretched resources, is it practical and most effective to have 2 officers in Seaham or Middleton and Teesdale leaving their beat area to transfer a prisoner to Spennymoor? Furthermore, is it an absolute necessity? If it is an absolute necessity, why should a location that has no magistrates' court be nearby? This creates a need for further prisoner transfer at a cost to the taxpayer.
Thanks, Joy. I'll answer this one. So with a centrally located custody facility, of course, there will be some areas from which officers will have to travel further with their detainees. However, in other areas, officers will in turn then find that the new facility is closer than their previous custody options. The current reality is that detainees, as we've heard, aren't always taken to the closest existing custody facility. GeoAmy, we've already mentioned, the company that transfers detainees to court, is actually located on that same estate next to the new custody facility. So with a new facility located there, they would actually be able to transfer them to court directly, rather than the current position, which is they have to travel to all 3 or potentially 4 if we're using Bishop Auckland custody facilities with the detainees from the first, then the second on board, while they go to the 3rd facility to collect them and then take them to court. So this will not only save taxpayers money, but it will also make the transfer quicker and then reduce the travelling time spent for detainees. The 2 magistrates' courts that are currently used in the county for remand and warrant detainees who are kept in custody are located at the moment at Newton Aycliffe and at Peterlee, and the majority of cases through the week are heard at Newton Aycliffe Court. So the new custody facility, should it be based at Durham Gate, would be closer to Newton Aycliffe than any of the current existing facilities, and travel time savings to Newton Aycliffe will therefore range from 4 minutes from Darlington up to about 19 minutes from Peterlee. Of course, when it's Peterlee, the magistrate court is attached to Peterlee station, so that would be the greatest travel time increase from the new facility, for example, for detainees in Peterlee. But that court only hears cases on Fridays. It's considerably further from Darlington custody than the new facility at 18 minutes further in travel time. So overall, there will be quite considerable savings in travel and time spent in the van for detainees.
Thanks, Catherine. I think the logistics, I'm sure residents will find that really insightful, because we don't understand sometimes when the courts are opening and the travel times, etc. So I think that explanation and the question was a very good question to give us that explanation. The next question is, a number of residents object to the building of a centralised custody suite because they believe it dilutes police cover when it's required most. Some residents believe that custody suites are in locations where they are most needed currently. With regard to the current capacity, they can understand that there are times when arrests at peaked and current resources struggle to cope, but they believe surely that these peak times are limited to a few hours in the week. So they would like to know, does it really warrant officers from, example, Darlington, bringing a shoplifter many miles during the daytime in a time-consuming process, and at the same time reducing police cover in a town that needs it? Jason, could you just unmute, please?
Oh, yes. So thanks, Joy. That's a really practical and good question to answer that. So at the minute, many offences and crimes are investigated already without people having to be arrested and taken to a cell or a custody suite. That's called voluntary attendance, whereby a suspect is interviewed, they're fingerprinted, they're DNA'd, everything you would do in a custody suite, apart from putting them in a cell. Not everybody needs to be arrested, and a case involving a straightforward shoplifting offence would absolutely potentially fill in that category of more than suitable for a voluntary attendance. So they wouldn't necessarily have to go to the centralised custody suite. If there's no aggravating factors, it absolutely certainly falls into the category for the remit for voluntary attendance. So all of the custody suites that we'll be leaving to build the new facility will still be left with fully functional and operational interview rooms, biometric rooms, and those administrative facilities that the officers at those locations need to do their job and to do those interviews without having to arrest. I say we do thousands of these already every year. It's not unusual. So officers at these locations will be able to conduct the voluntary attendance interviews whenever they need them, 24/7. And so this has been the case at many stations for many years. So Consett, Stanley, Seaham, Chester, for example, they all have interview rooms in them, but they're not custody suites. Officers can progress their investigation at their locations without the need for cell facilities. So it very much depends on the circumstances of the offence. If there's no aggravating factors, officers don't have to arrest, and quite frequently they don't, because it's more convenient and more suitable and more efficient to not bring them to a custody suite. We expect that process to continue, and where the facilities will still exist for officers to do that, so they don't have to leave Darlington, Peterlee or Durham stations.
Thanks, Jason. I think residents will find that interesting to understand what the centralised provision would do and what would be remaining in their own localities, and how that facility will still continue to be used. Thank you for that. Residents would like to know how much police time will be spent transporting prisoners to the centre from areas such as Consett, Stanley, and other towns and villages on the borders of other counties and cities. And will this task be contracted out?
Thanks, Joy. Again, I'll take this one. So I've got a little bit of data in answer to this question. So based on our 2019 arrest numbers, calculated for current evening rush hour traffic using Google Maps, travel time calculations for Consett, Stanley and Barnard Castle indicate the difference in time between the custody facilities that detainees were taken to after arrest, as you saw in the presentation earlier, in comparison to taking them to the new facility. So it is important to note that specific locations of arrest were not available. So calculations are based on a central point within that sort of parish area of the police station with the community. So it might not truly accurately reflect travel times, but it's a good demonstration. So for arrests within Consett in 2019, 90% or 490 of all the detainees arrested in the Consett area were taken to Durham City custody. So if they were taken to the new facility, this would take approximately 25 hours extra per year in travelling time, which equates to less than half an hour per week. And in a recent case, a detainee that we saw in the presentation earlier, arrested in Consett, was taken to Durham City custody, and officers had to wait half an hour before being able to book the detainee in. So and you'll see as well that officers have recently had to wait up to 46 minutes after arriving at Durham custody. Another example for Stanley area, so in 2019, just over 60% or 317 of all detainees arrested in that Stanley area were again taken to Durham City custody. And if they had been taken to the new facility located at Spennymoor, this would take approximately 16 hours extra per year in travelling time, which equates to just over 18 minutes per week. Again, in the presentation, officers taking detainees from Stanley to Durham have recently had to wait again for up to 46 minutes after arriving just to get in the door to book in their detainee. And this, as we've seen, is a regular occurrence. And again, in 2019, Nearly 38%, or 199 of all detainees arrested in Stanley, were also taken to Peterlee custody. So if they were taken to the new facility, this would then equate to 13 fewer hours per year in travelling time, so a saving of 15 minutes per week. And then another outlying area, just to give as a final example, would be Barnard Castle. So in 2019, again, 48%, or 39 of all of the detainees arrested in the Barnard Castle area were taken to Bishop Auckland custody. If they'd been taken to the new facility, it would be just an extra 9 hours per year, which equates to 10 minutes extra per week. And again, as you've seen, officers taking their detainees to Bishop Auckland have recently had to wait up to an hour before they can book their detainee in. So the new facility is going to be far more efficient than the existing facilities as we've explained. So travelling time isn't the only relevant consideration. They spend considerable lengths of time waiting outside the facilities because we simply can't overcome those blockages that we have with the estate as it currently is. So the new facility and the efficiencies that we've got there would offset the small extra travelling times that we've seen, especially even just for these outlying areas.
Thanks, Catherine. And I think that's really useful. And as a commissioner, that's something that we know that the public are asking those questions about the inefficiencies and travel and time and officers sort of being on their streets. So I think having that data is really important as we go forward to understand some of the inefficiencies that we currently have, but also the implications if we do choose to have a centralised custody suite, some of those areas that we're looking at that we can continue to monitor going forward. The next question is from a number of residents think that this will actually save officers and support staff time. And has the time and motion study been done into time wasted by officers queuing at the current custody suites or watching prisoners one-to-one, as not all cells have cameras? Are there expected time and cost savings by civilians being centralised to interview, etc., saving officer time to be dealing with calls from the public back in their own area?
Thanks, Joy. Now, again, clearly we've looked at this, and I think it's evidenced by the fact that we've given these specific examples of absolute delays, and I know you've witnessed some of them yourselves on various trips you've made to the custody suites. So as we've discussed, the Investigative Hub will absolutely make some significant savings in time, not only for officers who have to sit in the backyard of custody suites at the moment. Even if you take a couple of minutes off per trip for maybe an increased travel time, those delays will be much shorter, if at all, and I would hope there won't be any. But once they get into custody, those delays will be mitigated. We won't have to wait for medical professionals because they'll be there waiting for us. We won't have to wait for the mental health rooms because the minute we don't have any, we will have 2 dedicated use mental health assessment rooms for our NHS professionals to use. So we can have less delays for waiting for interview rooms because we have dedicated rooms. I know there's been some discussion about access to solicitors. We have a dedicated room for legal representatives to wait at the Investigation Hub. So at the minute, local solicitors come from, say, Darlington to Darlington Station or Consett to Durham. If they are expecting 2 or 3 prisoners throughout the course of the day to be dealt with at the Investigation Hub, they can wait there and we don't have to call them back continually from their home office, wherever that might be. So they're provided with an office in our building where they can use their computers, they can do their work, they can have a coffee, and equally they are there for their detainees and also allow us to progress those cases quicker. And on a similar note, appropriate adult professionals and interpreters, we have another room for them within the building whereby they can wait and be available to us when we need them to save those delays and getting them back. Because say these investigations sometimes take days. Oh, sorry, they might take over a day, might span on nights. Equally, we might interview somebody 2 or 3 times, and it might be a bit of a delay in between the interviews. So quite often the appropriate adults will go home, and then there's added delays in terms of getting back. They won't need to do that in this building. So you talked about civilians for interview. It's quite, we haven't really discussed it so far, but all of the prison handling team will be centralised in this one building. So at the minute, each station has a cohort of officers and civilians who are trained interviewers and investigators, and they deal with the overwhelming bulk of the prisoners we have, the detainees that we have. They will all be brought together into this one building and will form an expert team, of a centre of excellence almost, of interviewing skills and be able to deal with the detainees much more effectively and quicker in the one building than they currently do, whereby they might have to travel between stations depending on if on a given day Darlington custody is really busy, we might have to send interviewing team officers from another location to go and help them out because the particular station of Durham, for example, might be quiet that day. That as to travel, as to delays, we won't have that on this one building. So there's lots of elements really that will help us run this site much more efficiently. And yes, it's really difficult to quantify all of this, but absolutely, you've seen the delays, and they're daily. They're not unusual, and added up, they also add to a lot of frustration as well, which is impossible to quantify. But that frustration for staff and detainees and the legal professionals and social services will be providing a much more effective, much more professional, safer, and efficient process by doing what we're proposing to do.
Thanks, Jason. And as you say, and I know you've accompanied me around the custody facilities across County Durham and Darlington, and you know, I've seen that firsthand, and seen some of the complexities that could take, you know, hours. You know, when somebody may have issues, medical issues, where you need to sort of put all the resources into supporting those people. So I think also the earlier presentation that you gave, understanding the daily moving from arrest to waiting to processing, I think that's a really important to continue to look at that, and hopefully as we go forward, if we go to a centralised facility, we can show that there has been some efficiency, well, a lot of efficiencies, and to address some of the inefficiencies that we're currently experiencing. Residents would like to know why it's necessary to close the custody suite at Peterlee Police Station when it's barely 20 years old and it's still very much fit for purpose. The move to Spennymoor would be disastrous for Peterlee, taking officers away for far too long.
Thanks, Joy. So this is really very similar to sort of many of the other questions, which are location specific. You're right, Peterlee is only 20 years old, and as a functional station, moving the custody facility there or not operating it, it isn't at the minute and can't be compliant to the required standards. We've talked about in the 20 years since it's been built, those HMIC requirements for the standards of care, dignity, investigation, let alone the forensic standards, have increased so much so that we cannot keep that facility up to the required investigatory standards. So there will be a need to take detainees from the Peterlee, Horden, Blackhall area, Seaham, etc., to the investigation hub. And we've talked about that at the minute, detainees don't always go to the local station. So it's not the case that if you're arrested at Peterlee, you always go to Peterlee custody. Equally, if you're arrested in the Darlington vicinity, you don't always go to Darlington. People are moved according to organisational demand and need, staffing levels, how problematic the detainees in the facility currently are. All of these things are taken into equation at the minute and determined by a central hub as to where they go. And travel distance is only one part of the equation, as we've talked about sort of quite a few times. The queues are related to the inefficiencies of the existing facilities, and even once booked in, that lack of constant medical care leads to these delays. So yes, people from the Peterlee area, if they're unfortunate enough to be arrested, will go to a central location, but equally at the minute, you quite often find people from Peterlee going to Durham custody fairly frequently. So there is some difference, and there's going to be some change if we're to go with this hub, but it will lead to a much better, much more efficient process at the investigation hub. But it's a matter of organisational change and how we deal with our people and our staff and our detainees.
Thanks, Jason. And in a similar vein, I think that the transportation from moving from one area to a centralised suite is probably had, you know, there's different iterations of that. And the next question is very similar, but I think it's really important that we cover these areas for the public. So residents are also asking and would like to know if they are getting extra officers to cover those who will be transporting people to Spennymoor, or will we be more stretched than we are currently?
So as we've heard and we've seen in the presentation, officers currently transport detainees around the county to the 3 operational custody suites. And as we've said a couple of times, this may not always be the closest one to where they've been arrested. So somebody from Stanley, for example, can routinely be transported to Durham or Peterlee. And even in extreme circumstances, if the other 2 are full and it's busy, they could be taken to Darlington. So travel distance and time is only one part of the equation. And as we've said, even across the period of a week, we have officers queuing at existing stations, and often that is in the backyard of the station. And these are related to the inefficiencies of the existing facilities, the bottlenecks, the limited space, limited consultation rooms, interview rooms, etc. So even once booked into detention, the lack of constant medical care at the existing stations means that arresting officers are required to stay with the detainee until the medical professional arrives if they're at another custody suite. If deemed more serious, those detainees will be taken to hospital. So the proposed investigative hub is hoping to alleviate these issues with medical staff being based 24 hours a day, and medical surgeries, mental health rooms, which should remove the need for officers to stay watching detainees. So while there is in some circumstances an increased distance to travel for officers, as I've shown, that is going to be negated by the new facilities and the efficiencies that we will see. There won't be additional officers directly as a result of this project, but hopefully the public will be aware of the recent uplift and the ongoing uplift in officer recruitment.
Thank you, Catherine, for that response. And again, we've seen that it's not always the nearest station. And one of the examples that I saw when I did the shadowing is that we're actually taking people outside the area as well when the custody facilities were very busy. So every day is different. And so I think it's understanding that it's not always to the nearest, but it's understanding the complexities and our solutions to the current problems that we're experiencing. And this is a good one from a local resident. It's very much about the location of the proposed custody suite. So a resident from Durham Gate would like to know what plans are in place for the release of prisoners. Having been a police officer for 30 years themselves, they are unconvinced that all arrested persons will be transported home safely after their custody stay. They are concerned that if simply allowed out of the building to make their own way home, there would be a natural route through Durham Gate to the 24-hour retail outlets, and therefore making residents living in Durham Gate vulnerable to crime and antisocial behaviour.
Thanks, Joy. No, I understand the concerns that you've sort of spoken about there. What I would say to start off is that there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that people upon release from custody go about committing antisocial behaviour or crime. If you look at our existing 4 custody sites, they are all to a greater or lesser degree surrounded by housing. Bishop Auckland particularly is really much in a residential area. Durham has housing nearby, student housing just on the exit to the custody at the back. Darlington is fairly much residential behind it, in those streets behind. And Peterlee, not so much, but equally to get to the city centre, you walk past access roads to residential estates. We have no evidence whatsoever. And from the wider conversations I've had with colleagues across the country about custody builds, that people released from custody will predominantly get involved in ASB or crime. So I talked earlier on about the release process for Thrive, and certainly these considerations is something the sergeants I would expect to take into account when they're releasing somebody. If somebody is aggravated, animated, and making threats, etc., upon just prior to being released, the sergeant is going to change their mind about how that person is going to be released and the method of that release. They're not going to allow people out of custody if they're making threats or it's highly likely or consideration they're going to do some damage. But I say that's not something we've historically had in any of our locations. There's always exceptions, of course, but as a general rule, that is not what happens. And clearly, this will be hopefully the central hub for investigations across the county. There will be police vehicles in this area coming to and from, taking people, doing investigations. There will be preventative, obviously because of officers in the area, but it's not really anything we've picked up from other constabularies who've had builds that this turns out to be a problem. It's simply something we haven't experienced so far.
Thanks, Jason. That's really helpful. This question relates to gangs and arrest of gangs. So resident has said, when it's reported in the news about arrests of a gang, We often hear that those detained will be held at separate locations to prevent them from colluding. Also, when two gangs have been fighting, surely having them in one location opens up the possibility of two members of different gangs coming across each other, despite the police's best efforts to avoid this kind of situation occurring and continuing the violence within the custody facilities. In these two situations, residents would like to know whether a centralised custody suite will be a backward step.
Okay, again, thanks, Joy. It's a really good practical question, actually, and what I'd like to reassure you is we're fortunate in this county and Darlington that the fighting of gangs in the street is not a common occurrence by any shape or form. But we do have frequent instances where we arrest people, 3, 4, 5, 6 people, for example, for the same offence during an investigation, and equally we want to stop them speaking about it, or equally know each other's been arrested. So we do try and split them apart, do try and send them to different stations. So the Investigation Hub has 4 wings of cells. There are 2 entrances to it. Each wing has 12 cells. We can take detainees in via 2 separate routes into 2 holding cells if need be, and bring people past them, so they won't see each other walking past. They can be securely detained without them knowing each other's in. Booking in can then take place in discrete booking in rooms, and they can be processed without each other knowing that they're there. The opportunity to fight or talk will not be present. Equally, when they're in the cells, because it's 4 wings, you can't shout from one wing to another and be heard. The distance is quite large, and from within a wing, equally, the likelihood of being able to shout from one end to the other is very minimal. So once they're booked in, securely booked into the cells, in terms of investigation, we have interview rooms that are split from others, so we can interview people without having to circulate in the general wing and the general circulation area, so they won't be seen if we need that to happen. They can be medically examined separately from everybody else, which helps us with the minimising risk of cross-contamination of evidence forensically. So that's been taken into consideration, dealing with large-scale arrests, not really from the gang angle, but from the angle of keeping people apart when we need to investigate them without knowing each other's in custody, and that cross-contamination of evidence. So I'm entirely satisfied that we can manage those risks and manage those challenging circumstances, because we do come across them quite frequently.
Thanks, Jason. Conscious of time, we've just got another couple of questions, so if we can be quite succinct in answering them. But I think it's very important if we try and get them aired. A resident would like to know the impact of increased response times mitigated. Officers having to travel further afield to transport clients to custody. One resident who grew up in a domestically abusive household in Lincolnshire felt that the impact of having to wait 50 minutes for the nearest 999 blue light emergency response to get to them whilst being attacked by an adult. And they told me it was an absolutely horrific situation to be in. They want to know whether this move to a centralised custody suite will put more of the people you were here to protect at greater risk, not to mention increased pressure on your staff.
I'll try and answer your question quickly. I won't repeat myself about the blockages, etc. We've seen the benefits this new building will bring to that. What I would say is what we're trying to put into the building, what we are putting into the building is we're future-proofing it, we're putting new technology in, which would enable officers to go back to their home stations, to do the admin related to an investigation and an arrest back at the home station, to do it remotely in the vehicles parked up in the patrol area. So we're enabling them not only by the hub, but by technology, investing as an organisation to allow them to do the job more effectively. It's also really critical to note that actually arrests are a very small proportion of what officers do on a daily basis. They respond to many, many more incidents proportionately than they actually end up arresting. So whilst arrests and how we deal with those arrests are really critical, it's really important we do it correctly, proportionately they're a very small part of daily business for officers on patrol.
Thanks, Jason. The next question is, residents would like to know what's going to happen to the old sites if we go ahead with this proposed move. That's Peterlee and Bishop Auckland, etc. Will they be mothballed? Will there still be access to officers at these sites? Will there be any access to community engagement activities like bicycle marking? And are we losing more valuable strategic services?
So the opening of the Investigative Hub will absolutely not see any local withdrawal. Indeed, officers at those locations, Bishop, Darlington, Peterlee, they'll still see those facilities they require to undertake those voluntary attendant interviews that I talked about at that location, at those localities. So when we stop using the custody facilities, there will still be interview rooms, there'll still be biometric rooms, there'll still be admin rooms to allow them to do that work without having to arrest people. Because I've already discussed, a lot of the investigations they do don't actually need to be arresting people. The removal of these facilities that won't have any impact on the wider policing sort of actions that we undertake, such as bicycle marking as one example.
Thanks, Jason. I think this one is a really important one, and I think sometimes gets missed when we're looking at efficiency and effectiveness, and also the HMIC, the inspection reports, etc. But I'm really pleased that residents have asked this question, and they would like to know if the staff working from present custody suites favour this proposal and think it's the correct thing to do.
Overwhelmingly, they've welcomed the proposals to replace their current working facilities with ones that are clean, efficient, safe to work in, which in turn allows them to do their job professionally, which is what they want to do. And sometimes, and currently our current facilities, they inhibit their ability to do an effective professional job despite their best efforts, and to do it in a pleasant working environment. So overwhelmingly they're in favour. And it's really important to note they've been involved in this, they've been consulted, they've been involved in working groups in selecting methods of working, and also identifying to me what works and what doesn't work in the current environment. Some things they like, some things they don't. So it's trying to pick the best. Equally, we have a lot of officers who have transferred from other forces, speaking to them. What's good examples of operational practice in other locations around in the country, picking best practice, making sure we're getting the best what we can practically get. So overwhelmingly, they're in favour. And it's not just our staff, it's the medical professionals that work with us as a team. If you speak to them, the NHS employees we use, they see the facilities at the hospitals. We're not helping them do their job at the minute.
Thank you, Jason. And finally, residents have asked what will be the contingency plan if there's ever a reason for temporary closure of the centralised custody.
Okay, yeah, so the Investigative Hub has been designed to be really resilient from a technological perspective and an engineering perspective. It operates on the 4 wings of 12 cells. Each is able to be operated itself in terms of the ventilation, heating, associated features. We can effectively turn wings off. If we need to close a wing down for deep cleaning, to search it, if there's a major repair needed, we can do that and still use the entire rest of the facility. If there's something catastrophic, for example, we intend on keeping Peter Lee custody at the moment to be in a facility in a state whereby it can be used in an emergency, not for daily purposes, but in an emergency situation. It'll still be there for day-to-day purposes for the voluntary tenants anyway, so because people will be using the interview rooms, the biometrics and the admin facilities. The cells won't be used, but that facility is the most recent one we have in terms of modernity, and the wear and tear is the least because it's not overly used at the minute. So that one is there as a backup option. But absolutely, the Investigative Hub is inbuilt resilience, built to high specification, and we can use it and use it to our advantage.
Thanks, Jason. And so that concludes the questions. And this brings us to the end of our first accountability meeting. And I hope the presentation delivered and the questions that have followed have been very informative, particularly to the residents who very kindly submitted their quite challenging questions. In addition to the scrutiny I've already undertaken, I've also liaised with the chairs of both Durham Police Federation and Unison. Both have expressed their support and recognised the benefits of this proposed new custody provision in respect of there being better facilities for both staff and detainees. The response received from them is as follows. The HMIC conducted an inspection of Durham Constabulary's custody provision in 2019 and highlighted that our custody suites were dated and in need of major refurbishment. It is vital that our detainees are housed safely and appropriately and are treated with dignity and processed efficiently in accordance with the safer detention and handling of persons in custody. The proposed new custody suite will provide much improved conditions for both staff and detainees, including those who are vulnerable. For many years, we've been concerned about the lack of 24/7 medical provision within our custody sites. This new custody suite ensures that this provision will exist. To this end, we fully support the construction of this new purpose-built custody facility and the benefits it will bring for both officers, staff, as well as detainees. So in conclusion now, can I thank the Chief Constable and her team for their time and valuable participation in today's meeting, and all the residents that have taken the time to submit their questions. I will now reflect on today's meeting and contribution from the team, and intend to make my final decision about this proposal soon, and I will ensure that the residents of County Durham and Darlington, along with key partners and stakeholders, are informed of this decision at my earliest opportunity. Thank you.